Thank you. I have a very quick presentation style, so I've got about 5 minutes or so here to tell you everything that I possibly can about our studio and the work that we do. So let me know if you need me to slow down. All right, so usually these presentations start with a who am I, so that's not an existential question, that's actually just a setup. Short version is I've written more than 50 articles, book chapters, etc. around game design and have been publishing since 2009. I've also designed and developed scores of independent games, both through my critical gameplay practice and through Mind Toggle, which is more of a sort of commercial practice. I am serving my 3rd year as a board member for the Global Game Jam, a nonprofit that I feel very passionately about, and I'm currently the academic liaison for that organization. If you're not familiar with it, basically 30,000 people get together in a single weekend to create games in a very short amount of time, and they make some wonderful, charming, sort of simple mobile games and simple casual games. I've been teaching games in interactive media for more than 12 years, and according to Princeton Review, some of the programs I've directed are actually top ranked, if you care about rankings. And I'm also currently the director of American University's Game Lab and Studio. So if you don't know the institutional profile, in short, we're 6,700 undergrads and 3,400 grad students. It's a private nonprofit university in Washington, D.C. The initiative, the Game Lab that I direct, is actually 2 parts. It's a graduate program, and it's a game studio, where we're actually doing work for commercial clients. On the graduate degree side, we launched in 2014 with our first entry cohort, and the faculty shown here below include Ben Stokes, someone near and dear to Games for Change, Chris Totten, Dr. Mike Trainer, Dr. Josh McCoy, Bob Hone here, and some staff. And we've got these wonderful graduate students shown here. Some are actually here at Games for Change. And as mentioned, we are a sort of top-ranked institution, if you care about rankings. But on the game studio side, we've got a couple of clear agendas. And agenda number 1 is to develop research through our studio projects. So the idea is that we, as faculty, are all doing research in the games space, particularly in game design and implementation. So we want to use the studio as a venue for testing those ideas and developing that research. We also provide the students with real-world experience. So the students are actually part of the studio project teams. So our students are doing level design on these projects, they're doing art, development, etc. And then lastly, we want to provide real-world application for the things that we're proposing in theory. So we're actually going to put our ideas to test. So again, student members are team members, which is why I emphasize the graduate degree up front. So we've got folks from a very wide array of backgrounds. Some of our students are, one of our students is a PsyD in clinical psychology, and others a PhD. And on the other side, we've got people who are 1 year out of an undergraduate degree at a liberal arts institution. And we really try to play to that strength, to basically pull together a bunch of what we call engineered collisions in order to make the studio projects exciting and interesting. And the studio projects themselves are funded by a variety of organizations. The Knight Foundation, Educational Testing Services, ETS, the National Institute of Mental Health, the World Bank, Smithsonian American Art Museum, and a variety of private organizations that generally have me under NDA because, of course, we're in DC and I can't talk about half the things we do. That's DC, right? So one of the things that is kind of impressive for our short run is since 2014, we've signed more than $500,000 in game contracts to do a variety of projects from very small tasks around improving engagement to much larger educational research projects that are running 2 and 3 years. So some of the things we're really proud of include the Indie Arcade at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and we do this in partnership with an organization called MagFest. It's a music and games festival. In short, one of our points of pride is the fact that we got more than 11,000 people to attend the Smithsonian American Art Museum's exhibit in a single day. That actually makes it the 4th largest event in their history, which we're quite proud of. And that's one of our hallmarks of our community engagement activities. And we do things like organize game jams and all these sorts of things. We've also participated in the White House Game Jam, so it was great to see the Learning Summit folks here. And we develop projects, right? So this is a sample of a game that it's currently in development for ETS, and I can't talk too much about it, but it looks cool, and you're gonna love it when it comes out. And of course, we're doing work around clinical trials. But what I'd like to do next is emphasize our favorite partner, the National Institute of Mental Health, and I'll let David take it from here. Thank you.
All right, so thanks for that. So again, I'm David Pagliaccio. I'm a postdoc at the National Institute of Mental Health. And I'm going to try and give a quick overview of the neuroscience of attention bias and anxiety and give you a sense of why we're interested in building this partnership to develop a new treatment for anxiety disorders in kids and adolescents. So I'll just quickly touch on sort of what our lab focuses on, go through a little bit about attention bias to threat, brain mechanisms that we're interested in, and how people have tried to use this to create a new treatment. So I'm a neuroscientist by training. I focus on brain imaging of mood and anxiety disorders in kids and adolescents. And I've been working with the section on development and affective neuroscience at NIMH for a year now. And our lab generally tries to focus on understanding different clinical phenomenon. And so here we're really interested in understanding anxiety symptoms in kids and adolescents. And our lab really tries to take two tacks to understand this. So one, looking at a cognitive level, so understanding different cognitive and psychological processes that are awry in anxiety that might help us understand how to treat it. And the other level is at the neural level. So we use brain imaging to try to understand the different neural substrates that underlie these different cognitive processes. So attention bias to threat is the one that I'm going to be talking about today. And so to kind of explain that, I'm just going to go through the very prototypical example that gets thrown around in the literature to explain attention bias to threat. And so the example that's given is if you imagine that you're walking around in the woods, hiking, you may see a snake on in the grass in front of you. And we have this system in the brain that allows you to identify that snake as a potential threat. It's passed through several visual areas to process that visual information. And that visual information is then flagged by the amygdala as a potential threat. And once the brain processes this as a potential threat, you'll get physiological responses. So say increases in heart rate if you become afraid, and then muscle movements to get away from that potential threat. And the important thing about this is that everyone has this system in place in the brain. It's very normative, evolutionarily advantageous, and it's sort of working all the time to identify threats in your environment. And we think that anxiety disorders, this system is essentially overactive and ramped up, and is identifying threats in the environment excessively. So sort of the other example that I like to give is that personally I don't go hiking all that much, but if you imagine being up here giving a talk, the system is still in play identifying social threats in your environment. So you may tend to focus on negative threats in your environment, so someone on their phone not paying attention, giving you a dirty look because they don't like what you're saying. And people with anxiety may tend to focus on these threats more than say, more positive figures in your environment. And so that's basically what we're talking about when we say attention bias to threat. But we really need a way to quantify this attention bias to threat in the lab. And I'm just going to quickly walk through the tasks that we use to do that. So we have people come into the lab, they'll sit at a computer, see a blank screen with a plus sign on it, and then two faces will appear on the screen for half a second. One of them will have a neutral expression, and one of them will have an angry or threatening expression. And this flashes up for 500 milliseconds, and then it's replaced by an arrow on the screen. And their arrow is either going to replace the neutral face or the threatening face on the screen. And all we ask them to do is tell us which direction the arrow is pointing. And we use this to quantify attention bias in the lab by saying, how much faster are you to identify the direction of the arrow replacing the threatening face as compared to the neutral face? And so we think that anxiety likely involves both an intrinsic tendency to allocate more attention to these threatening faces and difficulty disengaging from these potential threats. So we think that people with anxiety disorders are more likely to be looking at the threatening face once it disappears and is replaced by the arrow. And so if they're looking there, they're going to be faster to tell us which direction the arrow was pointing when it's behind a threat as compared to a neutral face. And so the other main thing that our lab does is look at brain mechanisms, and we do this mainly by using functional magnetic resonance imaging, as was mentioned earlier. And so just quickly, one of the things that we've looked at is if you look, for example, in the amygdala, so this region that's involved in threat processing, we see that when people are doing this task in the scanner, people with anxiety disorders tend to show greater activity in the amygdala when viewing threats as compared to healthy controls. And some recent work in our lab, we're also looking at how the amygdala is connected to other higher order regions that help to regulate our emotions. And we see that these connections are weaker when people are trying to perform this task. So anxious people have less connectivity between these regions when viewing threatening faces. And so this work in the field really led to people trying to identify ways to modify this attention bias to threat in order to alleviate anxiety disorders. And the way we do this is fairly simple. People will play this task over and over and over again. So they're going to see faces and then an arrow, faces and then an arrow, faces and then an arrow. But the trick to this is that the arrow is always going to come behind the neutral face. And so in order to do well on this task, you need to learn to shift your attention away from the threat. And it's a very subtle manipulation. People don't consciously realize it, but over time they can learn to, again, shift away from threat and focus on the neutral. And there's been a variety of studies that have looked at this in the literature, and they tend to show a moderate effect of this attention bias modification in reducing anxiety. And this is about half a standard deviation difference. In our lab, some recent work, we also see that the strength of the connections between the amygdala and these higher order control regions helps to predict who's going to respond to treatment as well. And so given this, we always want to make these therapies better and more effective. And this is really how we led to this collaboration with AU to try and make this game more engaging, increase learning, and really just make it a better experience for the kids. And so I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about that a little bit more.
Part way in, hang on. Okay. So as you heard from before, I'm a health game designer, senior producer, manager of the AU Game Studio. A little background on me, a little bit longer background. I had chemical engineering background and then journalism background, typical career path. I then worked for PBS doing science documentaries, created a design company. We won a bunch of awards for doing things with NSF and NIH money. Wrote a book, taught a bunch, received a bunch from the NSF and NIH, and currently at AU. And so that's kind of set me up for this. And we'll be talking about Seeing the Good Side, which is our kind of working name for the title. And the main goals for this were, as David had mentioned, we want to reduce symptoms in children with anxiety. My personal preference for designing health games is that you want to make the game useful for clinical purpose and not just as an extrinsic reward. So it's not broccoli and ice cream, it's better tasting broccoli. We have to design and produce and tune an effective game for less than 60K. This is probably going to be the cheapest game that's ever been built for a clinical trial. I skipped over. And then building something that's going to be used in a clinical trial puts new demands on you in terms of making sure it's bug-free, because you don't want to ruin a subject because they ran into a bug. The main kind of technical folks on the NIH side are Daniel Pine or Danny Pine and Yair Bahame, and they're kind of leading figures in the whole ABMT field. Lindsay, myself, and David, and that's kind of the core team kind of pulling this together. And it's really been a partnership. I mean, we're going to bring our stuff to the table, but we get to work with awesome people who really, A, understand their science and are willing to sort of talk with us and work us through understanding what that is. So it's really been a fabulous sort of a combination of those two things. In terms of health game design, the way I approach things, we want to identify a non-gaming therapy. That's been easy. These guys have already done it, right? We want to create a game that mimics key aspects, design it to provide a difficulty staircase, and I'll explain what that is, tune it to the needs of a target audience, and evaluate it in the clinical trial. So let's take a look at that first one. So again, as David mentioned, they've already got a working system. So we know what it is that we're trying to aim at. What's hard for us to do is if there's never been something out there, then we might not even develop a health game, because we want to know that there's something that's non-game based that's going to work. It's going to be a lot easier to make that sort of function well for us. This one was a bit harder. So what I asked Danny for was, is there a book where I can get smarter about the science of attention? And as David mentioned, people have really understood the neuroscience of attention way better than they did 10 years ago. And so basically it comes down to a visual search task, as the example David mentioned, and then you're training away from threat. So then what kind of game would involve those same verbs, right? How do we get people to do a visual search? And when you phrase the question that way, hidden number puzzles or hidden object puzzles are a great way to do visual search. And if you want to train away from threat, you put the numbers away from the threatening faces. So again, once you phrase the question right, the answer is pretty simple. But I wouldn't have gotten to that question without that book. So it's been a great partnership that way. So here's an example of the artists that we create, the kids we created. And watch the left side. Those are now scowling faces. So we now have sort of this character set where we can put the threat on either side. We can change it amongst the characters so we're sort of ethnically balanced. And then on the right-hand side, kind of in purple, you'll see that these are now the numbers that have been outlined in purple. So we put them away from stress, from threat. So if we put the threat on the right side, we put all the numbers on the left side. Okay, difficulty staircase. So what we want to do is we want to get people engrossed in a game and then increase the challenge of it so that they stay engaged, right? They're going to want a little bit harder because they're going to get smarter. And if we're making it so that playing the game has clinical benefit, then we're basically increasing the dose of the treatment. The more that we can kind of keep them on that staircase, the more we can keep making the dose period last longer. This one is particularly hard because I tend to focus on deficit situations or people have a particular condition, so Parkinson's, MS, CP, or in this case, anxiety. So you're not building it for yourself. You can't be the tester, right? Because they're going to have particular needs. So a long time ago, 21 years ago, I went to E3, one of the first E3s. And there was a designer, business owner who talked about the core of a really good game, right? That's what his idea of it. And as you get better, the game should ramp up and challenge you. And that was Trip Hawkins, founder of Electronic Arts. And so that's been a great model for me. Another one is like you have a bar. You jump up and grab the bar. Once I can grab it, I raise it a bit more. I raise it a bit more. And as long as those steps in between are good, then we're fine. I realize it's running from a... Okay. So one of the ways we approach this task is by looking at how can we build an iterative system that allows us to do a lot of tuning. So in this case, we have 3 different pieces. So we have a designer dashboard, we have a puzzle construction kit, and we have a player tracking module. The feedback from the tracking module then floats back into the designer dashboard and also the puzzle construction kit. This is the game parameters page. I'll just give you a close-up. So this allows me to say, what do I want to be for an easy game? How many points, how much time, what are my penalties, rewards? The programmer never has to do this except setting up the system. As a designer, I can now tune that. Here's the puzzle construction kit. And looking up close, I can pick a number. I can then adjust its position. So here I can XY axis, opacity, scale. So we basically can tune that. So if a number, with our tuning testing, if nobody's finding the number 1, we can see it, we change it, we put it back in the system. We've done 3 rounds of tuning on this game. Here's an actual brief look at the game. So basically when you find a number, we throw up a balloon and we remove it from the bottom. Very simple interface. This is the data tracking. So basically for each one of these, we're able to say which number and how many people found it and didn't find it. And at the easier levels, we want people to generally be able to find most of the puzzle and most of the numbers. At the harder levels, we're going to basically allow that maybe they're only going to get maybe 10 out of 15 or 13 out of 15. So again, that comes from the fact that we've got this nice system. And this is a system we use for pretty much all health games. We want to basically allow the designer to keep tuning it for the needs of that specific audience. This is the gaming therapy. So basically, we're combining both the ABMT that the NIH has already developed, and then you have the puzzles in with it. And so a complete session is probably around 30 to 45 minutes. And then what we're going to be doing is we're basically going to be running these in different sessions. So one session would be 3 ABMT and 2 puzzles. And then this is for the next additional sessions. So if it's 2 a week, that would be 3 weeks. If it's 1 a week, that would be 6 weeks. And then when we get to the next round, we get to kind of getting tired of seeing the same backgrounds. So you have to kind of worry about engagement of the players. So basically, we then changed up the backgrounds by making it look later in the year, and then also creating a new art room. So that's pretty much my talk. I do think we can get a working version of the game done after your talk, so we'll see if we can actually make that work. So, great.
All right, and I'm just going to finish up by giving you a quick walkthrough of the outline of our clinical trial, just to get a sense of how we are going to be testing this. All right, so as was mentioned earlier, we're going to try and do a randomized control trial of this gaming therapy. So the overall goal, again, is to test whether attention bias modification can help lessen anxiety among children and adolescents. And for our lab, we're also interested in identifying patterns of brain function that may predict successful treatment with the gaming regimen, or that may change with successful administration of this treatment. And so when kids and adolescents come into our lab, they're going to be randomized into one of 2 conditions. So we have an active condition that we think is going to help with anxiety. So they're going to get the attention bias modification that we've been working on before. So seeing the faces with the arrow coming up 100% of the time behind the neutral face to help train their attention away from threat. And then these active puzzles that Bob was just talking about. So numbers are hidden away from the threatening faces. Half of the kids are going to be randomized into a placebo control condition. And so in this, with the faces, it's essentially the way that we, the same thing that we do to assess their attention bias. So half the time the arrow is going to appear behind the neutral face, and half the time it's going to appear behind the threatening face. And so there should be no learning to shift attention away from threat in this condition because it's balanced between the two face types. And they're also going to see neutral puzzles, so none of the kids will have an angry expression. And the great thing about this for testing treatment efficacy is that these 2 conditions are very well matched for engagement, and you can't really tell them apart when you're doing it. Kids don't know to look for where the arrow is. It just sort of happens along the way. And so this is just a brief overview of how we run the clinical trial. So again, kids are going to come in, we assess them clinically, we do a full workup, and then they're going to do some fMRI scanning with us. So they're going to perform this task in the scanner, as well as a variety of other tasks that I didn't really talk about here. And then they're going to be randomized into one of these 2 conditions. And the 2 main things to note is that the whole study is double-blind, which means that the families that are coming in for treatment don't know which condition they're in, and the staff in our lab won't know which condition they're in until the very end. And we're also going to do this over the course of 12 weeks, and every session that the kid comes in, they're also going to receive cognitive behavioral therapy with a trained clinician. And so CBT is really the gold standard of interpersonal therapy for anxiety disorders, because they're coming to the NIH and we really need to help them with a definitely efficacious treatment. And we want to see if this cognitive training will enhance that treatment. And across the 12 weeks, both parents and children are going to rate their kids' anxiety, as well as the clinicians that we have on staff. And once the 12 weeks are over, they're going to come back for another full clinical assessment and some more scanning so we can see if there are changes in the brain with this treatment. And so this is just sort of a schematic of what we're hoping to see, which is that over the course of the 12 weeks, kids in both conditions should see decrements in their anxiety because they're working with a trained clinician to get cognitive behavioral therapy. But we hope that the active treatment is really going to lessen their anxiety more over the course of these 12 weeks. And particularly, there's a 4-week period at the beginning where they're really just getting acclimated to CBT, learning what that's about, but we don't really expect to see any benefits from the CBT itself. And this is a period where we can really test whether the active cognitive training compared to the placebo is really having an effect. And then we hope to see an increased benefit over the course of the whole study. And again, since we're a neuroscience lab and we're interested in brain mechanisms, we also help to look at whether, so say amygdala activity that I talked about earlier that's increased in anxious individuals, whether when they're done completing this training, do we see a decrease in amygdala responses to these threatening faces? With that, we'll thank you and take any questions for the panel.
Bob, are you going to start off the questioning to get everyone?
I was going to quickly actually run through the games online because we were able to get it through this system.
Fantastic.
Except it's not.
But you can start.
Yes, certainly.
Questions
Yes, certainly.
ready.
So that's. I just had to move the mouse. We're going to sleep. But we lost her. Well, actually, go with the question first.
Great. Question number two.
So our lab focuses on kids.
I'll repeat the question just in case people haven't heard it. So the question was, what is the age range? Absolutely. Thanks. The question was, what is the age range of the study group?
And yeah, so our lab focuses on kids and adolescents. So we're looking at kids 8 to 18, essentially. Basically anyone in the Bethesda, DC area that's going to come in for treatment.
Next question, 1, 2.
Are you going to compare the efficacy of the game versus the regular
So the question was, are we going to evaluate the efficacy of the game versus the standard ABT treatment?
And so we actually just finished a clinical trial with just the standard version that one of my coworkers is analyzing now. And so we're not going to have another arm that's just the standard version alone, but we have that data to compare to when we're done.
Great. Question in the back? 1, 2. Yep.
Go ahead, thank you.
Pharmacological trials of
It's not it. It's the longer version.
So the question, so you could hear it, was essentially, do we have a sense for how placebo effect is affected by games, or compared to pharmacological trials? Okay, I think that's the question.
Yeah, and I mean, so this kind of relates to the prior question as well. So we won't be able to directly compare in this study whether sort of doing the game itself is better or worse for anxiety. But as I mentioned earlier, the nice thing between the placebo condition and the active condition is they're very well matched for the experience. And so any differences sort of in expectancy effects that you're doing this game at the NIH, your anxiety is just going to get better from doing that potentially, should be balanced across the two conditions.
Let me jump in because I was setting up to be able to run it. So one of the questions when starting this project was, Danny and Yair have sort of made their name with this ABMT. And if we did just the game by itself versus ABMT, we weren't sure that we could have, because it's the first time out, we would necessarily have the same level of effect. They're doing hundreds of repetitions of a neurologic training. The puzzle may be a useful adjunct or addition to it, but by itself, it was also going to be a harder design challenge, right? These guys have lived with this thing, and we're going to come in and say, we can do what you've done better? Like, really? Right? So we're game designers. So there's always going to be sort of a ABMT, the traditional one, plus what we're doing is we're using less ABMT in terms of number of repetitions per session than they would have in their other, right? Or in a normal system. So that's does that help answer the question? So that was more sort of a collaborator political question, right? How can we as designers kind of mess around with stuff where it's if we're the whole ball of wax, then we're not going to have as much chance to play. Or experiment. So here's the actual site that we use. This is our main setting. You saw this from previous. So I click on the game settings, and so this is all the different, so these list of numbers down here, that's the menu when we go into the puzzle of all of the puzzles that get done. So there's 24 numbers. If I want to introduce a new one, I just build a new one and put the number in this list. Done. Right? We don't have to go back to the programmer. Oh, we've got a new puzzle. Can you put it in for us? I can do that. Right? Or more importantly, two of the graduate students. I kind of blew through that, but Alex Cha and Ying Chong Ling were the people who designed the puzzles. I checked them. I did model ones, but I could hand them the tool, and then they actually go ahead and do it.
And they were first-year graduate students.
Right. This is the puzzle editor. So for example, this 9 in her blouse. So if I wanted to go over to change that, I can then just come in here using the keyboard, make it more visible. And that's, Could not be easier, right? If I want to see where all of them are, you just go that, and that highlights it. In our first versions, we forgot to include a show all answers page. And that was like, that's kind of dangerous. You got anxious kids, you're not going to tell them what the answers are? So this is actually in the game, so we could just say, turn that on in the game. And so click a button, see the rollovers. And then finally, back to, and we've got several different categories because we basically want to be doing testing with David's group at the NIH. Then we have our own personal testers who are unaffected, but at least they're sort of closer in age to, say, myself or a grad student. So let's see, we've been clearing out, like a, that was interesting. Oh, we're back. Let's see what we got here. So here this is actually the same thing I had in my presentation, but now we see there's 3 people have tested it. Right now, nobody has found 4, 5, and 6, and 10. Now, with 3 numbers, you know, that's not enough to be actionable. But once we get to like 15, you'll get some clear indication, like you thought that was easy to find, but as a designer, you know where the numbers are. You know, we actually learned that you had to build one, test one, you know, to be able to remind yourself of what the players do. So that's basically the different pieces of the system that I was trying to design. To talk about very quickly for an example of the game. Again, this is in testing mode. So just going around. And some of these, I forget where we've hidden them, so they're really good tests for me. Etc. So, all right, back to the questions.
Next question, yes?
Game-based therapies, is it all affected by the frequency with which the children are already gaming?
So the question was, for those who couldn't hear it in the back, is there a relationship between efficacy and traditional gamers, people who are already playing games, and people who aren't?
And that's a great question. I don't really know specifically for anxiety disorders with this type of thing. It's definitely something that we can ask about before the kids go into the
So as the game design or other game designer in the room, I would actually say one of the challenges here in answering that question is that game mechanics are very different. And so someone who plays Call of Duty frequently may have a very different set of skills than what this is demanding, and also engagement strategies, right? So exactly.
I mean, it is nice that we have sort of this stair step in difficulty, because if for some reason, you know, this kid does a lot of highlights magazines and is really great at finding hidden numbers, you know, we can step up the difficulty.
Right.
Right. And it's deliberately simple, right? It's not a very complicated game. But again, it's mimicking the visual search task and the training away from threat that David is doing in the more clinical version.
Great. Question here, and then 2.
Do you have an intense screening process, and have you factored into this any imaging? Because obviously, without the imaging, what we now know, without that, isn't that kind of not significant, because you do not know what creates the anxiety. If you don't pinpoint it, then you're not going to know what your true results are going to be at the end.
Sure.
Let me jump in first. That's why we love working with the NIH, right? If we had to fund their part of this, it would be hundreds of thousands of dollars, right?
Are you doing it? Are you
Th-
screening it,
th-
imaging it?
So David, go ahead now. No.
What do you mean in terms of screening?
In other words, you just said, I live in the DC area, you're at Cheddar Chase, those are not normal kids, those are not inner city DC kids. So the anxiety disorders in terms of their experiences would be very different. So how are you screening your applicants, and are you creating imaging before and after to see if there is any visual differences?
Right, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so we do have a lot of clinical evaluation. So they'll do full assessments with clinicians in our lab to get a sense of all of their symptomology across all types of different disorders. They do a ton of forms that we'll look at. We talk to the parents as well. We really only screen people out if they're outside of the age range, if they can't complete the study, if they're not going to be able to come reliably in for treatment. and if they have other disorders that we're not interested in treating here. But we'll take kids with social phobia, generalized anxiety disorder. We don't deal with PTSD in our lab. But it's really just kind of a all-comers at this point. And they are going to do fMRI scanning before and after, as long as they don't have braces or other sort of metal in the body. And we're not really at the stage of saying, you have this pattern of brain activity before treatment, that means you're going to be a good candidate for this. This is really a first pass to say, does this work at all? And hopefully, once we understand sort of changes in brain mechanisms, we can look at, are there particular subsets of kids that are going to respond to this better based on their brain activity?
And also the subject pool are people who are referred to the NIH clinic, right? It's obviously a research facility, but they get referrals for their clinical research.
Yes.
So, one challenge that kind of I see in kind of the framework you set up, and I'm curious how you thought about this, is that there are definitely cases in the literature where gamification destroyed the efficacy of the gamified task. And so, like an example of this, like is the NDAP task that the ACME has done, where essentially putting in motivational components disrupted the process. In the case that you have, essentially you have something that resembles kind of a negative priming type situation in your base task. And then when you have your new visual search task, then really the way that attention is deployed, the extent to which the bases are salient factors, is changed tremendously from your baseline. And so you both have an issue in terms of, how the motivational features of the game potentially changing the situation away from the learning outcomes you might have had before. And also you have a dramatically different attentional set in this training. And I'm just curious, have you worked through these types of issues? Have you tried, different variants of the gamification to see, how that, leads to different attentional deployment, thought that out?
Well,
I am not going to try and re-articulate that question, but I think we got, yes. So.
Well, actually, just before David answers it on the technical level, most of the people who have been game designers for a while avoid the term gamification because that implies basic extrinsic motivation off the top. So just FYI. I mean, if you talk to anybody who's been doing this for 10 or 15 years, we look at those guys as shysters. Anybody who says, I'm a gamification expert is not one. So just FYI. Now answer the more technical question.
I mean, at least in terms of motivation, one of our collaborators has looked at this a bit in terms of applying different sort of motivational techniques, giving you points or money for doing well on, the faces and arrows part of this task alone, and doesn't really find any sort of benefit or detriment from changing the motivational component of that. So that is nice that we don't think it's going to harm anything by including sort of incentives as part of the game. But we haven't really tested a ton of different alternatives as to combining these two parts of it together. But we're going to do some piloting soon, which will hopefully give us a better picture of that coming up.
The other thing I'd bring up is that one of the things that our studio does a lot of is we're actually about the business of increasing engagement. So we have a $250,000 grant from the Knight Foundation to try and re-engage you with the news, for example, through games. And it's less about motivation and far more about how do we keep you on task? How do you keep you there? And I actually think that's one of the big challenges and one of the benefits of games these days is that we can solve this challenge where there's plenty of media for us, but the problem is it's pulling us in all kinds of different directions. And a lot of media producers are asking the question, how do I keep them here? And so what we're doing with, say, ETS is explicitly about turning tasks that are hard to assess into tasks that people will remain engaged in so we can get a thorough assessment. And part of our strategy that you see here, and you'll see in a lot of the projects that our studio does, is that we're actually doing it through casual games instead of creating these AAA-like aspirational projects that assume that if I give you a rich world, you will stay engaged, instead of, can I give you a couple of mechanics that keep you engaged long enough for us to get our task done and then move forward. So it's less about incentive-based activities and more, for example, like step models and using specific structures to keep people engaged.
So just to respond to that real quickly, is that the key issue is engagement to what? And that, the specific scenario that you have here is that you want to have engagement to some part of the space that is in reference to some level of processing of both the negative and positive faces, but in such a way that it biases processing towards positive away from the negative. And that creating that type of engagement, as opposed to engagement to find the numbers, that might make it so that you don't attend at all to the physics, is the key challenge of, the game you're trying to achieve. And that's the question that I have is really, how do you do that right? And, it's unclear, from just viewing this, whether you explore that space to kind of understand, how the difficulty of the number search task is impacting the level of processing of the patient.
If I can turn the question around, do you think this is a fruitful area of inquiry?
The part that I'm asking, I think it's actually fundamental, because the thing is, so I run a brain game center out at UC Riverside, and so, I spend essentially all my time looking at what are the subtle changes you make in a training task that will either create a better learning effect or completely destroy it.
Right.
And that these tiny little factors that from the perspective of how do I create a task don't seem to matter are fundamentally critical in terms of the efficacy of these families of interventions.
Fair enough. I think one of the things is we're trying to train away from threat. What we're trying to train towards is, I think, what you're asking about.
No, but also you can only train away from this threat, provided that threat is processed to a sufficient amount that it then can be suppressed.
Absolutely.
If the threat is never seen in the context of your task, then you cannot expect that you're going to be training away from threat. It's one of the aspects of my line of questioning.
With 3 to 4 minutes left, I think we should actually have this conversation further.
Yeah, fair enough.
Just in case anyone's sort of like, wait, I have my question.
Yeah, because we actually evaluated the sort of level of accuracy or realism in the images as in terms of what was the proper place for us. So we can go on to that. Other questions?
And we worked in like millisecond interactions at one point.
Right.
As we were working through this. Yes, in the back. 1, 2. Yep. Yep, reiterating the question, why not use eye tracking? And since it's cheap, et cetera, why don't we look at that to see whether or not they're avoiding the threats?
So we did a little bit of that work. Yair Barham is in Tel Aviv, did a little bit at the beginning of it. He got busy on some other stuff, so that hasn't been a primary focus, but we're certainly planning to do that. We're doing the pilot study this summer, and so the actual clinical trial probably won't start until September, October. So we have started this other round to kind of go through, and yes, we're certainly going to do that.
Question up front.
Is as game designers, is fun something that you guys kind of kept in mind and something that you would seek to push for in your game as to kind of alleviate anxiety in itself and create kind of positive correlation between like, all right, these children are seeing distressful factors like these faces or whatever, and then experiencing fun regardless, and is that something that you would track in your results of this test?
So if you mean, could we provide a larger context for the experience? We wanted to have it almost be like a graphic novel where the puzzles were set within regular comic structure. And so you get a whole backstory in terms of the fact that you're giving a book report today, and that's why some of the kids are angry at you, and that's all great for phase 2. But we had to do all this under 60K, so those are all ideas where we'd like to go. We'd love to go real-time 3D, right? But at a 0. So.
Budget.
Yeah.
And the other trick here is that we are trying to create a succinct experience that can fit within the context of clinical trial, and we can actually say, like, use this as a treatment. So once we start asking people to commit 3 to 4 hours a week of activity, it may become more efficacious. It might also create new challenges.
I mean, unofficially, what I'm hoping, if this turns out to be effective, and that's what we're doing the clinical trial, but if this reduces it, my daughter has anxiety. So if that calms her down, we'd send each kid 3 puzzles a day. And what we do is we say, if you want a free puzzle, you got to build one, right? We got the puzzle builder. So parents, you want free puzzles for your kid? Build 5 puzzles, you get 5 puzzles. So now we have this platform for, and trust me, parents with anxious kids would love to help other parents. So that's kind of the big picture down the road, and that's like 2.5, 3 years from now.
Great. That is all the time. Thank you for coming. We'll be around if you have other questions.